For most Americans, young and old, the history of the American Revolution can be summed up a little bit like this. In 1776, all the colonists rose up in unison to rebel against a terrible tyrannical king and the horrible burden of unfair taxes the British had imposed upon them for well over 100 years. During the long war that followed, citizen soldiers shivered in the cold. Everyone willingly shared hardships together. The whole country admired George Washington, and America won the war single-handedly, without any help at all, against the most powerful army in the world. Then they created a perfect democracy, and everyone lived happily ever after. Now, except for the part about shivering in the cold, this myth is just that, a myth. And I'd like to point out about the shivering in the cold. Everyone has seen the pictures of Valley Forge, the soldiers with no shoes on their feet and everyone eating shoe leather with a little hot sauce on it. The reason they were shivering in the cold at Valley Forge was not that there were no supplies and no food nearby. There was plenty. But the Pennsylvania farmers, being those great patriots that we all know and love, were charging absolutely exorbitant prices for everything to Washington and his army. Not only were they charging ridiculously high prices, but they were cheating the army blind. They would deliver barrels of what was supposed to be flour, and when they had been paid for and they opened the barrels, about this much was flour and the rest was sand. And one of the reasons they were barefoot was the shoemakers from the region were making shoes out of scraps of leather, selling them to the army, and then when the soldiers wore them, they fell apart. So even the shivering in the cold is not exactly what we think it is. Like all good teachers, I'm pretty resourceful, and so I'd like to use this myth as a starting point for a talk on the Revolution. And in fact, it really provides an excellent outline for that talk. Let me begin with the image that the Revolution was a spontaneous reaction to decades of horrible oppression by the British government, especially unfair taxation. The British, like the French, Dutch, Portuguese, and Spanish, were empire builders, and they created imperial policy that was designed to enrich and to empower the hub of that empire, what Americans would rightly call their mother country. The operating economic theory of the time was mercantilism, and its tenets were really rather simple. A nation's goal was to be as self-sufficient as possible so that no wealth, that is gold and silver, flowed out of its borders, and to produce something that other nations couldn't produce but really wanted, so that wealth would flow into its treasury. Like the old 1960s joke, whoever had the most toys when they died won the game of empire building. To achieve this goal, European nations conquered lands and created colonies where new marketable raw materials, and if they were really lucky, like the Spanish were, precious metals might be discovered that could be sold, and where staple agricultural products could be produced that would feed the mother country. From the beginning, therefore, the colonies existed for the sake, the welfare, and the enrichment of the mother country. It was the logic of the imperial era. Rules were set to ensure that the colonies served the larger goal of national glory. Colonists were forbidden to trade with the enemy or to pay heavy import taxes if they did. They were forbidden to ship goods or produce in enemy ships. They were forbidden to engage in manufacturing activities that competed with the activities of the mother country. And they were forbidden to create laws or institutions that ran counter to the laws and institutional structures of the mother country. In exchange for loyalty and obedience, the citizens of the British colonies could enjoy the protection of the British Army and Navy and the constitutional guarantees that were called the rights of Englishmen. England, however, unlike all the other empire builders, tried to build its empire on the cheap. Indeed, it found a million ways to govern in a manner that Uncle Scrooge McDuck would have approved. Unlike France or Spain, its crown was never willing to finance colonies. I mean, think about the founding of the American mainland colonies. Not a single one was founded with the British Army or the British Church traveling hand in hand with the settlers and providing for it, as you would see in the Spanish Empire. They did not finance the colonies either in their settlement or in their operating costs. They left all of this to private trading companies, to wealthy patrons, and even to dissident religious groups like the Puritans. And by the 18th century, the cost of running each colony fell squarely upon the residents, who were taxed by their local representative assemblies, assemblies that were made up of colonists like themselves. From the building of roads to the dredging of harbors, even to the royal governor's salary, the daily costs of the colonies were paid by local taxation, and not a penny came from the British treasury. So cheap was the British government that it even failed to enforce its own trade regulations with any vigor. Given a choice between financing customs collectors to prevent smuggling and a judicial apparatus to try the offenders, the Crown preferred to look the other way at infractions in a policy that was humorously dubbed salutary neglect. Colonists, seeing the cookie jar unguarded, did just what we might suspect. New Englanders, in fact, built their thriving economy on a mixture of legitimate trade with British West Indian islands and completely illegitimate trade with the rest of the Caribbean possessions of rival nations. Over decades, smuggling became an absolutely respectable practice. John Hancock, Boston's richest merchant, Hancock was not the brightest crayon in the box. He was actually adopted by his uncle, who had no children, and brought into the business, and so he inherited from Thomas Hancock, who had built the smuggling operation, but John Hancock did expand it, and he became the richest merchant in Boston. He was also its most notorious, or in Boston, most admired smuggler. And local assemblies, who had thrust into their hands what 18th century men called the power of the purse, taxing power, were quick to see this as a benefit, not as a burden. Elite colonists who dominated these assemblies shifted as much of the tax burden to frontier farmers and the middle classes, reaped the benefits of deciding how the surpluses would be spent, and used their authority to pay or to not pay the governor's salary as a wedge to secure his support on measures he was supposed to endorse. I may have mentioned before, they would go to the governor if he vetoed an act that they wanted to see passed. And a representative from the assembly would go to the governor and would say, I'm paraphrasing, "Gee, Gov, we're really sorry to tell you this, but we just checked the finances of the colony, and we just don't have enough money to pay you this year. We're really, really sorry." The governor, who was not that stupid, would a few days later say, "You know that bill you passed that I vetoed? I've changed my mind. I'm going to approve it." And then a representative group would come from the assembly and say, "Gov, the most amazing thing happened. We forgot to carry the 1 and subtract the 2, and as it turns out, we have a lot more money in the treasury than we thought, and we can pay your salary, and more than that, because you're such a terrific guy, we're going to give you a bonus." Well, it didn't take even the dumbest governor long to realize that the way to get along was to go along. On occasion, the British government would wake up from its long imperial nap and try to rationalize its management of the colonies. In the 17th century, James II created the Dominion of New England, which, despite its name, merged New York and New Jersey with the New England colonies into one big administrative unit. But English politics was none too stable. James was driven into exile. His Dominion government, the hated Edmund Andros, was promptly imprisoned by the colonists, and the mega colony was dissolved. the heavy hand of the Crown sometimes did come down on particular legislation, usually involving currency or banks, but the whole salutary neglect was the preferred relationship of the 18th century. Small wonder that America's leadership toasted the glories of membership in the British Empire. The French and Indian War, as I pointed out, changed all this. This first great war for empire that was rivaled only by the struggle against Napoleon over a half century later. And if you think about it, England and France continued to be bitter enemies until World War I. I mean, it's really quite extraordinary. What's wonderful is they accused one another of all the bad things that existed in the world. So, of course, the English called syphilis the French disease, and the French called syphilis the English disease. Of course, neither one of them had started it, though they certainly did spread it. Britain drained its every financial resource to defeat its enemy. In the end, they won, but its treasury was empty. It owed money to its creditors. Its budget for the military was growing rather than declining. And on the streets of London, citizens were rioting to see wartime taxes reduced. The new young king, George III, came into office with a crisis on his hands. Well, we all know what followed. Salutary neglect was replaced by concerted, though clumsy, efforts to tighten control over American trade. New taxes and the first taxes were imposed by Parliament. Smugglers were arrested and tried. Mostly they were not convicted, and the claim of tyranny emerged. But was there tyranny? Well, consider the real facts. The Sugar Act didn't increase the duty on foreign molasses. It lowered it. It slashed it in half. The real shock to all these New England smugglers was that the government was going to enforce this tax at all. What happened to the smugglers? The British government allowed local juries of their peers to try them, and they were all promptly declared innocent. John Hancock, as I've mentioned, was caught red-handed but found innocent every time. One of the ships that was taken into custody was ironically called the Liberty, and he was celebrated as a hero after the trial. After he was vindicated, everyone went out and he ordered drinks on the house for everyone at the local tavern. Did the British government retaliate? Only mildly. Frustrated after multiple trials of this sort, I mean, really many of these trials, it created vice admiralty courts that were perfectly legal to try the offenders in a less friendly environment. If you were caught smuggling, now the case was taken to a vice admiralty court that did not have a jury of your peers. But the biggest hue and cry of tyranny arose because of the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts. The Stamp Act was an innovation. It was not an infringement of rights, but an assertion of authority that had laid dormant for a long time and thus lost its potency. When Americans protested and when they harassed stamp officials, physically attacked custom men, destroyed stamps, the British tyrants responded by repealing the act. I want to remind you that all the violence preceding the American Revolution was by the Americans. There are accounts, rather chilling accounts, by Anne Holton, who was the niece, I believe, of one of the customs collectors in Boston, and she sees her uncle literally beaten to a pulp by men who called themselves the Sons of Liberty. And so anywhere you go, the stamp distributors who were hung in effigy, which I tell my students is a small town outside of Bayonne, New Jersey, but who were hung, and they write this down. You have to be very careful. They're very literal. They were the ones who threatened stamp distributors by hanging effigies and saying, this will happen to you for real if you do distribute these stamps. Jared Ingersoll in Connecticut was put in a cart with a noose around his neck. His hands were tied behind his back, just as a little warning that something was going to happen to him. He took the hint and he resigned immediately. So almost all of the violence that I can report to you are by the Americans. They chose the same path, that is, the British did with the Townshend Acts, which was also an innovation, but a dicier one because it taxed British goods. almost no revenue was collected from any of these taxes, and the colonists continued to reach into their pockets not to pay the crown, but only to pay their local legislators' taxes. I want to talk a little bit about the Sons of Liberty as an aside. What a wonderful name to have. The Sons of Liberty were organized by Samuel Adams, who, as I've said, is sort of the Abby Hoffman of the American Revolution. And here's who they were. In Boston, there was a North End gang and a South End gang. And because they didn't have the Super Bowl back then, what they would do is every year on Guy Fawkes Day, these two gangs would get as drunk as possible and go onto the Boston Commons and beat each other's brains out. And whoever had the most men left standing were the champions for the year. Well, Samuel Adams, who liked to hang out in taverns with working class men, said to them, in effect, how about instead of beating each other up, that we beat British officials up? Wouldn't that be more fun? And this is how the Sons of Liberty were originally organized. The same was true in New York, where the Sons of Liberty attacked British officials in New York City and in Albany. So this violence, which is orchestrated by the Americans, is certainly not the tyranny of the British government. How did the British handle the protests, the violence, and the organized resistance led by colonial legislators? Did they arrest the ringleaders? No. Did they close down the newspapers that carried diatribes and learned discourses against British policies? I mean, that's one of the first things that real tyrants do today in most countries is they close down the press, or they close down the dissenting press, and they have an official government radio station or an official newspaper. The British didn't do this. They didn't restructure the colonial governments. They didn't arrest the men who met in illegal political bodies like the Stamp Act Congress and the Continental Congress, both of which had no authority under British law. And they didn't declare a single one of these men ineligible to serve in office in their colony. Their response was to ignore the petitions, to refuse to engage in negotiations or discussions, but most importantly was to display a kind of bewilderment at the colonists' failures to understand how an empire worked and what imperial policy had to be. Not until thousands of dollars worth of property was destroyed in Boston Harbor did the government, many of its members investors in the tea company, retaliate. For the British, as it would be for the founding fathers of the United States, the sanctity of private property was worth protecting. It's amazing to me to see how patient and tolerant British officials remained over the turbulent 60s and 70s. It was not until 1775, when British troops marched toward Lexington and Concord, in what was reasonable on their part. They heard that Americans were stockpiling weapons there, and that seemed not to be a good idea for law and order, that orders were given to arrest the two men who were considered to be the prime ringleaders of rebellion, Samuel Adams and John Hancock. Patrick Henry was not arrested for declaring, "Give me liberty" or "Give me death." Common sense was not confiscated. I mean, the most incendiary book or pamphlet published in the colonies, and the press that printed it was not punished or shut down. Arrogant, foolish, self-interested the members of Parliament and the king might be, but they were actually victims of their own real commitment to the British Constitution and the rights that it guaranteed. In the end, the tyranny revolutionaries decried was the imperial system itself. That is, the notion that colonies existed for the welfare of the mother country. So it seems to me that the idea that there is tyranny that prompts American response is really unfounded. What ought to be argued is that the colonists had outgrown in many ways the imperial system. The second element of this myth is the unanimity of support for the revolution. We picture on July 4th everybody in America rising up and saying, we're going to fight against Great Britain. Did all Americans, North and South, white, red and black, female and male, rich and poor, greet the Declaration of Independence with enthusiasm? After the divisive experiences of the Vietnam War and the current divisions over the war in Iraq, it's appealing to think that there was an overwhelming consensus for independence. I'm often asked what accounts for the sudden revival of interest in the American Revolution. Hundreds of documentaries on the Founding Fathers and on Abigail Adams, lots of books on the period, and it seems to me that this is a kind of romance of the American Revolution where modern-day Americans who are terribly divided over the last two major wars can believe that there was a moment when the American public was absolutely united on an issue. But it isn't true. John Adams famously said John Adams said a lot of things. 1/3 supported the war, 1/3 opposed it, and 1/3 had no opinion. But here, as in many cases, Adams exaggerated. It's far more likely that at the beginning of the struggle, many, many more than 1/3 of the colonists hoped desperately to remain neutral in a battle between mother country and rebellious Americans. Their assumption was that no matter who was in power, they were going to have to pay taxes. So why risk their life over who it was that was going to tax them? Many a farmer equipped his home with two flags, the British and the American, and prepared to raise the appropriate one as the army marched by. As the war progressed, many of these neutral colonists did join the American cause, but this, as historians like John Shai and Charles Royster have shown, was not an ideological or a political choice. The British Army behaved so badly everywhere it went, looting, raping, destroying, taking goods and supplies, that it literally drove colonists into the revolutionary camp. One thing we have learned in the 20th century is countries don't like occupying armies. And that's what happened to convert so many American men into supporters of the revolution. But let's take a closer look at those who supported and those who opposed the movement for independence. To do this, I'd like you to imagine the revolution as a prism with many sides, and I'd like to focus on what we would call self-interested motives. We've talked about materialist versus ideological motivations. This is not to say that men and women chose their sides in the war solely for economic reasons or to satisfy their own ambitions. Ideas always influenced people and influenced Americans, and ideas shaped how Americans articulated their choice for rebellion or loyalty, and how in the long run they understood that that choice reflected their values and ethics. In other words, ideology and language allow people to understand in a way that's suitable to them what they are doing. Bernard Bailyn has shown us that by 1776, most of the revolution's leadership believed that the British government had sunk deeply into decadence and tyranny, which they saw as connected, and had broken the contract between governors and the governed that John Locke had so eloquently described as the only basis for legitimate government. If you remember the social contract, the purpose of government and its legitimacy was that it governed to protect the life, liberty, and property of the people. In exchange for that, the people were to be loyal to the government and obey its laws. If either side broke that contract, that is, if the government was not acting in the interests of the people had not only a right, but in many ways, an obligation to destroy that government and to create a new one. In the American Civil War, this was the argument of the South. The South said that the Union government represents the interests of New England, is oppressive to the southern states, and consequently no longer is a legitimate government. And this is one reason why they believed they absolutely had not only a constitutional right to secede, but a theoretical, in terms of political theory, a right to secede from the Union, or as my students often say, to succeed from the Union. We also know that leading loyalists who opposed independence believed the revolution was the creation of demagogues and men with thwarted ambitions. To them, the renunciation of the crown and of the greatest constitutional government the world had ever known was wholly unjustified. But the critical choice to rebel or remain loyal depended to a great extent on where one stood in relation to others within the society, that is, upon the material realities that shaped a person's perspective. Who then was more likely to become a revolutionary? Let me suggest 4 broad groups: smugglers and urban workers, planters, colonial legislators, and African Americans, both slave and free. Let's start with the most obvious: smugglers. As you know, British policies after '63 struck hardest at the New England colonies. With little of value to trade directly to England, no rice, no wheat, no tobacco, or little tobacco, New England's leading citizens made their profits by competing with the mother country in the shipping trade. The post-1763 policies like the Sugar Act threatened more regulation, more restrictions, and eventual economic disaster. Merchants like Hancock found ready allies in those urban workers, the distillers, the lumberjacks, the fishermen, and the shipbuilders whose livelihoods also depended upon smuggling that was made possible by salutary neglect. It's not surprising when you think about the dependency of that entire region on illegal activity that Boston did become the center of protest, of reprisals, and of the rebellion. What about planters? Again, legend has it that the Tidewater or coastal planters led the way in calling for independence. Yet current historiography suggests that in Virginia, at least, the Virginians we think of as the founding fathers were actually reluctant rather than eager revolutionaries. 3 things propelled these men into the revolutionary camp. First, the great burden of debt they owed English and Scottish merchants, who provided them with credit for the purchase of land, slaves, and most especially those luxury goods that men like Thomas Jefferson craved. You know, Jefferson died bankrupt, but with the best wine cellar and the largest library, and what I irreverently call the McMansion known as Monticello. Secondly, pressure from ordinary farmers and backcountry settlers who wanted the right to move on to Indian lands, a right that the Proclamation line had denied them, pressed upon the Tidewater planters to rebel against the British government. As the protest against Great Britain grew during the 1770s and as the tension mounted, wealthy Tidewater planters feared that a war was inevitable, and as they put it in letters to one another, they could either lead this rebellion or they could be trampled under the feet of the patriots in the western counties. Thirdly, the provocative policies of Virginia's royal governor, Lord Dunsmore, whose proclamation offering freedom to the slaves of traders raised the specter of slave revolts and race war. It was probably the most foolish policy and provocative policy ever put forward in the colonies. Dunsmore said to the slaves, if you leave your master and join the British encampment, if your master is a traitor to Britain, we will give you freedom. Well, nothing would spur Tidewater planters more than the vision of angry, armed African Americans and Africans fighting against them. Legislators, those men who ran the assemblies in each colony, also had good reason to join the revolution. There were 2 routes to power and status in the colonial political world: appointment to office by the king or the governor, and election to office in the colonial assembly by white male property owners who enjoyed the right to vote. Historians have shown that the same wealthy families dominated colonial assemblies, with fathers passing down to sons the duty and the privilege of serving. Robert Zemsky has a book called The River Gods about Connecticut, and he's traced the members of the Connecticut Assembly for many generations, and he finds the same families dominating year after year after year. Many were lawyers or had legal training. Most had an education superior to their fellow colonists. And through marriage, many were part of interlocking families. By mid-century, the Assembly was the de facto supreme power in most colonies. And British policy trends after 1763 threatened their supremacy. As Britain realized that the assemblies had evolved into mini parliaments while they weren't looking, assuming extensive rights, efforts were made to reassert the authority and sovereignty of the English Parliament. In the end, and far too late, the king authorized independent salaries for governors and judges, removing that bargaining power that the assembly had used effectively to force the governors to bend to their will. Every effort on Britain's part, independent salaries, and especially the reorganization of the Massachusetts government, threatened the position and the power of this colonial elite, and it drove them into the camp of rebellion. Finally, many enslaved and free blacks supported the revolution. The rhetoric of the revolution, liberty and equality, no matter what the white leaders meant by that, gave hope to free African Americans that they might receive better treatment within their communities. For the enslaved, the rhetoric mattered less than the fact that service in the military, offered late and very unenthusiastically by the revolutionaries, they delayed a long time before they agreed to arm slaves, provided a route to freedom for many. So who opposed the war for independence? Loyalists might be considered in 5 groups: royal office holders, merchants who traded directly with England, once again slaves, backcountry farmers of the lower South, and most Native Americans. So let's begin with office holders. Winning appointment to a royal office was the second major route to political power and a sure route to wealth. These posts included governorships, lieutenant governorships, attorney generals, judges of the vice admiralty courts. If you remember, Thomas Hutchison was a greedy fellow, and he was head of the local court. He was the lieutenant governor in Massachusetts, and he really monopolized as many royal offices as he could, which is why he was the most hated man in Massachusetts. Salaries for these positions were generous, status was high, and none of these people had to stand for office or woo voters. Most royal officers remained loyal to the crown, not simply because of their pocketbooks, but because their positions gave them a different perspective on Britain's problems and policies. It's rather like moving from the classroom to administration. When you're in the classroom, the administration is your enemy. You can't understand why they don't cough up the money for you to do something. When you move into the administration and you really study the budget and you realize in many cases the reason they didn't give me that money was they didn't have it, you develop a quite different perspective. And that's what happened with these royal officials. They had a broader imperial view than the merchants or the shippers or the planters. And because in the 18th century, taking an oath of loyalty, as all of these men did to hold their offices, meant something almost sacred, they did not want to go against their oath. Merchants. While many New England merchants depended upon smuggling, both here, there were others, both in New England and in New York and Philadelphia, who made their living from the sale of British manufactured goods. Family connections, religious ties, or simple good fortune made these men able to establish credit with major British manufacturers or middlemen. Their warehouses were stocked with everything from carriages to panes of glass to iron tools and bolts of cloth. These men would be bankrupt if the trade with England were cut off by war or disrupted by independence. You can practically guess perfectly whether a merchant is going to become a loyalist or a revolutionary just by seeing what he sold, just by seeing the trade route, as Arthur Schlesinger Sr. told us many, many years ago. Enslaved African Americans appear in both categories, patriot and loyalist, and their presence on both sides of the war remind us dramatically that the Revolution was not one war, but many wars. While Patrick Henry declared that he would prefer death to slavery, his own slaves shared that sentiment. When Patrick Henry was asked why he didn't free his slaves, his response was, "It would be inconvenient." But the slaves' war was not against unfair taxation or royal tyranny, real or imagined. It was against the more immediate tyranny of the lash. For slaves, the old Arab proverb surely applied: "The enemy of my enemy is my friend." The formula was reasonably simple. If a master was a loyalist, the slave was a revolutionary. If the master was a patriot, the slave made his or her way whenever possible to the welcoming arms of the British Army and prayed every evening that their master would be hanging from a rope on a tree. The Revolution was different for Indians or Native Americans as well. Most understood that the colonists were land hungry and would not honor tribal claims if they stood in the way of westward settlement. The British had shown their willingness to search for diplomatic resolutions to these territorial disputes. The proclamation line was, in fact, one of the few truly statesmanlike decisions of the post-French and Indian War. Given a choice between the two, Cherokee and Mohawk and most of the Iroquois Confederation threw in their lot with the British. The Indians were no fools. They understood diplomacy. So when the French fought the British, they sided with the French because the French were not land grabbers and the French respected Indian ways. They learned Indian languages and dialects. When France was eliminated, the Native Americans sided with the British because while the British weren't as good as the French, they were a lot better than the Americans, who the Indians knew were going to take their land as fast as they could. So most Indians, Indian groups, especially the Iroquois led by Molly Brant, were fighting for their own war for independence. That is, independence, liberty, and freedom, a war very different from the war being fought by Adams, Jefferson, and Franklin. By far the largest group of active loyalists were the white colonists of the Carolina, Georgia, and Virginia backcountry. It's this group that gives the Revolution yet another really important dimension. That is, the American Revolution was a civil war. And it adds irony as well. These Tidewater patriots who took up arms against the British, declaring no taxation without representation. Yet for decades, they had refused to allow backcountry farmers to organize counties and thus had denied them representation in the colonial assembly. There's a petition from the backcountry farmers of South Carolina to the South Carolina legislature that lays out no taxation without representation. The legislature has the nerve to take that petition, mark out to the Assembly of South Carolina, and change it to the Parliament of England and send it on with great anger to the British government, insisting that their rights had been violated. Having no political voice, these farmers found themselves denied any benefits of tax revenues. No decent roads were built linking them with the coast. No courthouses were constructed. If you wanted to buy or sell land, you had to travel all the way into Charleston in many cases to get to a courthouse to register a deed, which was an expensive and time-consuming occupation for these backcountry farmers. The only colonial official they ever saw regularly was the tax collector. After years of petitioning, these frustrated citizens actually took matters into their own hands, and in 1775, the same year as Lexington and Concord, North Carolina farmers armed themselves and marched against the Tidewater government. This regulator movement was easily defeated. But the following year, as news of independence spread, these farmers armed themselves again and signed up to fight on the side of the British. The war that ensued in the Lower South was horrendously violent and brutal. There are accounts that would really fit on a CSI show of pregnant women being slit from the throat to the gullet, of scalping done by both patriots and by loyalists. So angry were these two groups with one another for decades of political anger that had built up. Colonists killed colonists, sparing neither women nor children. So the unanimous uprising of colonists against a tyrannical Britain is a myth. In its place, we have a more interesting and more complex event, a multitude of different wars for independence and liberty rather than a single one. This, I think, is a more interesting story, and one that acknowledges for us and our students the way in which race, class complicate colonial society, even as it complicates American society today. Thank you.